All right, this is Dave Margolin. Welcome to another edition of our forecast contest discussion. Very fortunate to have a couple guests here today. Matt Rogers is our featured guest, and we also have Jason Lynn, a returning champion from previous forecasts. Today's forecast lead is Zach Magis, and I'm going to turn it over to Zach right now.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Zach. For those of you who don't know me, I'm a senior here at Rutgers. I'm sure you all have been seeing my numerous emails. It's pretty much spam you guys 24/7. So just to get going on a little bit of forecast attribution today, we'll start with that, and then we'll work into everyone's forecast for the week, and then we can just do any sort of general discussion about what we see in the patterns. I think Michael talked about also sharing some of his research at the end, so that's kind of the tentative schedule. So to start with the forecast attribution, we're looking at the most recent verification. Came in at 50.3 gas-weighted HDDs. And what ended up happening was the 30-year normal that's our baseline, 49.3. So because these two were very, very close, anyone who wasn't close to that value got hit pretty hard in our aerometric scores this week. So if we sort, EC was the worst performer, industry had a hard time, and the CFS actually had a hard time too. So we kind of saw last week was our pattern shift, and as we have seen in the past, the EC and the CFS sometimes lag behind and keep that pattern for another week or two. As we can see, both the EC and the CFS stayed warm when the pattern had already shifted to cold. So we'll see if next week they finally capture what's actually happening. Other numbers here. Pretty much everybody had a negative score except for the MJO Analog and Preston Page, who I believe is a student at Albany. But overall, a little bit of a rough start to the heating season. So if we switch over to Dynacast, this is a plot of the average temperature departures for this most recent verification. We can see there was a lot of below normal cold in the eastern half of the U.S., and a lot of above normal cold. And if we switch back, we can just see what the average temperatures were for the period. So yeah, we can see it's tough to see it based on the two plots that I've shown, but we can see that the temperatures for this time of the year seem to be a little bit cooler than normal in the southeast and warmer in the northeast compared to normal, which is just a little bit different of a pattern than we saw last week, where there was a lot of below normal cold in the west and above normal warmth in the southeast. So I believe one last thing I wanted to show was So these are the 500 millibar heart departures. As we can see, there's a lot of below normal heights across pretty much the entire country this week, or for this most recent verification. So, this is kind of just an overview about what happened. Does anybody have any specific thoughts as to why the forecast was so tough on all of us this week?
Not to put anyone on the spot, but Matt, if you have any thoughts, obviously we don't know what your forecast was, but you can see most of our forecasts were way too warm and didn't capture this, like Zach said, a situation from last week, but we underestimated the HDDs here.
Yeah, it was an interesting situation. I felt like the models were kind of getting stuck. They were stuck in that MJO phase 1 for quite some time there, and they weren't really progressing forward toward the Indian Ocean as much. And it seemed like they finally broke through recently and into the phase 2 space. And I felt like that just kind of finally moved things along, and we started to see a different response. I mean, it's like Zach showed us a pretty weird pattern when you have that troughing in the Gulf of Alaska and you still migrate cooling into the east. I think if I have my dates right, I think this might be a little bit of that I call it the typhoon trough, because of the super typhoon recurvature. Did that affect that period? I think it did, because I remember it was crashing the Gulf of Alaska low into the west and just crashing right across the country. It was a pretty impressive evolution, watching that energy come across the North Pacific. And then everything kind of tucked in underneath that Greenland block that Zach showed as well. So it was pretty impressive pattern there, rolling all that stuff through. Normally, if you look at a 500 millibar pattern like that, yeah, you see that pattern on the West Coast, you would not guess that would be what the East would look like. So it was a pretty impressive pattern.
That's great. Jason, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think this was the time when AAM got up out of the damn gutter.
Yeah.
We had -3 sigma AAM anomalies dominating the scene, maintaining subtropical ridging and positive tilt structure across the Pacific and North American sectors. And I think this is somewhat related to the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asian monsoon systems finally showing some withdrawal and not tugging as much westward on the mid-latitude jet structure across the Pacific Basin. And that actually gave you a more progressive feel to the flow. Your wave number increased across the Pacific. You started peppering the North American continent with more Pacific wave packets, and you finally went neutral to negative tilt with something that I think might have also included some Western Atlantic Basin tropical cyclone help to launch a little bit of the negative NAO there, and finally get some of these things coming out of the west to go through the Midwest and East rather than just escape to the Northeast over Central Eastern Canada.
Yeah, I agree with the GLAM pickup, the global wind going back towards the neutral range after being so negative before, and I think tropical activity helped in the northern hemisphere, both oceans too. I think it's definitely more of an El Nino response when you have an active West Pacific there.
And then I guess one other thing that I'd add, Zach, would you mind showing maybe surface temperature anomalies for like the end of September, like the last 5 days of September or something like that? September 26th, September 30th. So in the spirit of, attribution, there's no perfect answer. And, I wonder also, and I'm curious what you guys think of this, and feel free to tell me what you think of it. There was, I think during the initialization of this forecast window, there was quite a bit of cold up in Southwest Canada, a really strong pull of cold. See here in a second if memory serves me correct. Yeah, and if you go to maybe North America or something like that, it even shows up more. And I guess I wonder, I think it was Michael Garoon, who's on the line here too, who brought up, subjectively speaking, yeah, the fact that, when you look at the EC model, right, 16 days out, it always, again, this is subjectively, but I think there's something there, right? You see the ridges, you very rarely see the troughs. You see the reds, you don't see the blues so much, right? And I wonder, too, how much the models underestimated the scope and intensity of this air mass. And, what you said, Matt, like not only last week did we see it actually penetrate a lot further into Texas, right? That was the surprise last week when we look at last week's verification, right? It, instead of actually verifying, what some of the models had shown was something verifying close to what this looks like, and it had penetrated to Texas. And then as it swept eastward over this past week, what Zach just showed, that cold pocket in the southeast, how much of this was the fact that it just completely underestimated the cold that was originally there in Southwest Canada, that then moved into the middle part of the country, and then finally moved into the southeastern part of the country, that this is that final, we're finally washing out that tremendous cold air supply that was in Southwest Canada.
I'm 100% with you, Dave. That's perfect. I'm with you. I think that's indeed the case. I had been in one of my competitors actually had made a comment in late September that it looked like maybe the pattern may evolve similarly to last year. And last year we had a really strong cold air supply in Western Canada too. And by around October 12th, we flipped the pattern from very warm to quite cold. And I had some folks in that discussion were showing model 11 to 15 day map saying, nope, there's no cold air supply in Canada. It's not going to happen. And yet as it rolled forward into the 6 to 10 and the 1 to 5 day, all of a sudden the Europeans like, oh, wait a minute, there's a cold air supply here. And as you see on the verification, as it did show up. So yeah, it is a problem. The 11 to 15 day, it seems to miss the troughs and the cold air supply, even generated by strong blocking signals. It misses the surface stuff until it rolls forward. So I'm with you 100% on that.
Does anyone else have any more comments about this latest period? Can we move on to?
The only one other thing that I'll say about this, just because we've been talking about, in previous calls, we talked a lot about pattern transitions, and I don't think we have the plot that Luke's worked on. But, when you look at the ECMWF, going back to the summer, right, we've seen in a number of cases where it just did not seem to resolve well, these pattern shifts.
Yeah.
Right. And I feel like this is just, the September one was a really disaster, but there were a few of them, right? In other words, in August, it was actually the EC medium range forecasts were actually trending less warm. And of course, then we got the September which was like, record warm CDDs. So it not only did it not help, it really would have hurt in terms of trying to, try to get a heads up on these big transitions. And here we are again, the last couple of weeks where the forecast actually produced some decent HDDs. And, again, last week, if you had gone full bore on the EC, the raw EC, it would not have steered you in the right direction. And, it's just an observation at this point. It seems like we saw that in the summer, and so far we're continuing to see that in terms of, hey, if you're looking for a pattern transition, be wary about, putting too much stock on the EC.
All right. I think we can move on to this forecast for this week. I will switch over to. All right. So I'll start. I'll give you a brief little rundown of my forecast method for this week. Still adapting my strategy a little bit. This is only my third or fourth forecast for the heating season, so I haven't yet found something that really works for me yet, and we've only had one verification, so it's hard to know what is working so far. But this week I took a look at this plot I thought was particularly interesting. So this is the 2-meter temperature departures from normal based on the EC output. As you can see, we only see a little bit of above normal warmth in Florida, parts of California, and in New Mexico and Arizona, and pretty much normal temperatures across most of the U.S. And then I think the CPC showed something a little bit different with a bit of below normal cold in parts of the eastern U.S., particularly I can see Chicago falls into that region, so that's something to keep an eye on. And then, normal temperatures in part of the Northeast, and then we see this pretty strong warm pattern in parts of the western U.S. and a particularly strong pattern in Alaska as well. So factoring those two, where in the EC output, I see that the temperatures look about normal for most of the country, but then in the CPC, although it doesn't look like it agrees, what I interpreted this map as is the cool in the eastern U.S. and then all of this warmth will kind of even itself out. We do see like I said, Chicago falls into that cold range, and then most of the Northeast is normal, but then we see the warmth. So I figured that those two would kind of equal each other out. So I kept my forecasts right around normal at 81.7, and I kept my spread normal as well. So who would like to go next? Dave, you want to go?
I can go next.
Oh, Michael, yeah. Go ahead. Do you want to share your screen?
And we should say, Matt in particular, if you have any questions or want to drill in, as a guest host here, feel free,
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
To answer your question, Zach, no, I don't need to share my screen.
Okay.
There's nothing really new here. So I looked at my usual stuff, teleconnections, NAO, PNA, and AO. NAO and AO, they look like they want to head towards positive to start November, while the PNA looks like it wants to stay negative. So I took that as a cold west, warm east signal. And then the CPC, I looked at that and I read their discussion. They seem, based on, and I could be misinterpreting this, but based on reading their discussion, it looks like the models are in some disagreement, with the Euro saying trough east, and the CFS saying trough west, and they mentioned the JMA saying trough central, so there seemed to be some confusion among the models there. So I think that might be indication that there's some type of pattern shift happening around this time. I'm not sure about that though. If someone else wants to add in there, sorry. So I went with 78.4, slightly warmer than the 10-year. And I increased my sigma just a little bit to account for the possibility of there being a pattern change during this forecast period.
Dave, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. Could I share my screen just for a second? All right, let's see. And if I can find the screen, there we go. All right. So I'm input number one here. So going through the 2-minute drill here. In terms of the major takeaways, I did put my formula statement, which you can see it's the bottom row there, and then my strategy statements below there. I know it's in small type, but the main takeaways were that I continue to put a little bit more weight on the 30-year normal, at the expense of some of the shorter term kind of normal indicators like the 10-year, and I've been using the trend and stuff like that. The basis for that is the idea that we're shifting into the cooling season or the heating season, away from the summer, and that in my view, right, climate change, things like that have had less of an influence on U.S. demand in the winter than the summer. So that's why I made that adjustment. I didn't change my adjustments in terms of EC or CFS. I continue to weight the EC about 30%, CFS 0. We actually, again, one of our other guys who's doing some of the work on looking at skill performance with the CFS showed actually that there was a negative correlation this summer with skill. So anyway, I don't have anything there. So tropical forcing, I did look at some of the tools from both Paul Roundy, and which is up here, and you can find these in our tools and tips. And then this is from Caitlin, a former student at Albany. I think it's a really cool product. And the bottom line is I didn't see a clear signal to shift away from that formula statement. If anything, I kind of saw some mixed signals. With Paul's tool, I kind of saw maybe a shift back to more from cool to normal to warm. And with Caitlin's tool, I just kind of saw what a kind of a muddled thing. I do want to share one other thing that we're working on. A few of us are working on this with Zach and also Professor Decker here. This is a phase diagram showing lag relationship at 16 to 20 based on this time of year. And it's color coded by the type of anomaly. So kind of blues are cold or above normal HDDs, and the reds are below normal. And the takeaway for me at this time of year is that it's muddled. Another data point, I should say, that kind of shows it's muddled. So you go where it's initialized. So, we're somewhere around here, phase 2, somewhere out here. And the reason why also you see a lot of blank space is because it's between -5 and +5. So that suggests there's not a lot of strong anomalies. And if anything, there's, obviously a little weak warm anomaly here, but then it's muddled. So I don't see something strong here. I'm not going to do this now. In a future update, we can show what this looks like, say, if we were initialized in mid-December or mid-January. When you get to those times of year, these signals become much more coherent, as you would expect, right? And I think there things may change. But based on those factors, That's, oh, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong screen here. But that's basically how I came up with today's forecast. So unless there's questions, I'll shift it over to either Jason or Matt. Jason, I don't know, did you want to talk about your forecast today?
I'm not going to submit a forecast, but I guess for the sake of discussion and setting up Matt to spike something into the ground, I'll give you some thoughts.
Oh, man.
So I would be leaning towards like the 10-year or slightly under, taking a bit of a shot here to play some return of convective forcing into the Eastern Hemisphere. The positive IOD is a concern. The freaking western half of the Indian Ocean's on fire. The eastern half is cold. The 200 VP Huffmolar from the latest Euro Weeklies continues to hint at a return of Eastern Hemispheric convective forcing, and it maintains some eastern propagating mode activity across the Pacific and Atlantic basins, but it kind of hints at two regions of forcing. One back there over the MJO nursery areas of Eastern Africa and the Western Indian Ocean, and another over the warm West Central Pacific SSTs. And when you do some silly stuff like, constructing an analog composite of all of the November phase 1 plus 6, 7, 8, 1 sigma projections, you get something that's pretty wild. It's got some positive P&A flavor with a slight warm lean in the west, but a slight cool lean in the Midwest, quite muddled though. And the best cold anomalies actually retract back into the prairies in West Central Canada. And it still leaves room for a negative EPO. Basically, it says some negative AAM with short early winter wavelengths and a little bit of bleed through the east, but the core cold is not released into the east. So I think that's probably enough when you mix in neighborhood warm SSTs around the US. Anytime you're not having active cold air advection through the Midwest, Ohio Valley, Mid-Atlantic, you're going to get much warmer than ensemble means or analogs think, because you're going to pull off of trajectories that have source regions that are, have high heat content and elevated dew points. So that kind of makes me lean to the warmer side here. And I know I got crushed with the plating on too warm for too long in one of the October forecasts, but that was mostly a timing issue. I'm going to try to basically go back to the bear side here for just a little bit. Not a big, huge warm surge. More of a increase in variability that removes polar air, as much polar air off the table for now. Maybe we use it later towards the end of the month. So I guess I'd be like 75, 77 range, something like that for your gas weighted HD total this period.
Okay, yeah, that's great, interesting. So we've got quite a range here so far. And I think that leaves the best for last here, Matt. And would you like to screen?
Yeah, that's cool. I'll take the screen share on that too. I'm at 85 for the 16 to 20 day, and I see that there's industry number one is 87.5. So there's somebody is colder than I am, but so I'll be the second coldest, I guess. I like what. Can you see my screen there? The 16 and 20 challenges.
Yeah.
Okay, good. I like what Jason was saying about the Indian Ocean stuff, because it's really fascinating to me how the MJO got into phase 2 really stronger than the models expected, and but then it just collapses before it gets to phase 3. So it hits those cold waters that Jason was talking about. It's just pretty crazy how that's playing out. So let me see if I can some movement going too. Winter's coming, but there's a lot of pitfalls along the way. So let's see here. And I'm having some screen issues. But okay, so here's the end of the European ensemble. And this goes back to David's point earlier about how the European is really good, or at least better anyway, at showing the ridges, but it really struggles to find the troughs. And so it shows a really strong ridge over the Gulf of Alaska area, at least in terms of height anomalies. And it also shows a pretty impressive negative NAO block continuing. And a lot of times I'll see people say, well, there's no cold air connection. It's just not there. And usually what happens as this rolls forward is you see this trough over the Hudson Bay, that'll become the connection point right through there, right through the Canadian archipelago. And so you get your cold air resupply into Canada in that route. But it tends to miss that and its hyper blocking look that it has here. But it also has warmer heights in the southeast. So that's kind of a red flag. Don't go too cold, because you've got some hints of a southeast ridge concern again, or maybe it's a very strong hint to the forecast. So, but you've got a very powerful negative EPO, which is pretty impressive to me for a day 15, 50-member ensemble mean, and also negative NAO, which is also pretty impressive for a 50-member day 15 situation. But I thought it was really fascinating to point this out, and someone else pointed this out earlier today. January 1st to October 21st through yesterday of 2019, we've had this southeast ridge problem for a while in terms of hindering upper level blocking influences. And it's just been a recurrent theme. It was a very big issue last February, and it's off and on over the summer and here in the fall as well. And it was also an issue in the fall of last year too. And it creates a challenge when you're predicting heating degree days, because you get some cold to Chicago, but sometimes you really struggle to get to the East Coast and South. And what I looked at here for this map was I looked at negative EPO November. That's moderate to strong, minus 0.5 to minus 1.5, negative NAO, minus 0.5 to negative 1.5, and then also with a negative PNA lean. So we get more troughing toward the west. And I got only 3 cases out of the 50 plus years of history, I guess 60 plus years of history. And those show that southeast ridge issue. But what it's been showing, and this is what's been verifying here in October as well, I didn't show that graphic, but in October we have had this mid-Atlantic to southeast ridge look, but the cooling has been breaking across the top, across the Great Lakes and Northeast as well. And so I was getting that a lot with these types of years when you had strong EPO and NAO blocks and a southeast ridge. And that gave you an above normal HDD answer. And when I went through some of the other years that had maybe some snapshots of this pattern, I saw that too. And then one more thing to show you, this is the 1 to 15 day overall height anomalies from the European ensemble matched up against the top analog years. So these are the top 10 years with the highest R squared to the 500 millibar anomaly pattern over the entire 15-day period. So I'm not just looking at the 11-15 day, which is of questionable skill, but I take the entire 15 days, average them together, and come up with the top years. And here's what the 16 to 20 day looks like for these years if you progress it forward. So you see there's another chunk of cold going into the plains and western Midwest for that time period. You still have your southeast ridge. It's not going away, but you have a pretty strong cold push from Chicago to Texas again, reflective of that negative EPO persistence. So I'm not a big persistence person usually, but as you saw in my percentages, I did factor a third weighting on persistence, and then also on analog, what you might call progression here, and then also on the European ensemble at the end of the 11 to 15 day. I was just looking at the Euro Weeklies for fun. Here's the 16 to 20 day from the Euro Weeklies last night, and this 51%, over half the members favor Jason's forecast for the 16 to 20 day being warmer or near a 10-year normal. Another third shows a big cold outbreak that's all the way through the southeast ridge. And then another 16% are probably the Goldilocks answer, which still has some warmth on the East Coast, but then a stronger cold chunk back in the mid-continent again, which is a kind of a blend of how October's been verifying, except for European has a habit of missing the stuff that goes over the top, over the Great Lakes and Northeast, that cooling that we saw underneath the NAO ridge. It's having trouble with the NAO ridge to see it. But, and then also, if you look at the 500 millibar clusters, I thought maybe this one was the most reasonable one, but it was only 18%. So, but again, it's an issue where the European, most of its members miss the cold trough parts, but it seems like it's trying to catch it. That's not, this picture here is not too different from what I showed here on the analogs right there. So I do think there's another cold push in the mid-continent, but I want to be cautious on the East Coast. So I went with 85. I was looking at last year's cold outbreak around the same time, and I think the answer was 96 heating degree days. So I'm still about 11 below last year's cold outbreak because I'm trying to account for the southeast ridge resistance. But that's kind of where I came about with my number today. That's it from me.
Did you just drop the mic?
No. Can you hear me?
No, I was joking.
Oh, drop the mic. I'm a little slow. I'm sorry. I got you. It's an interesting pattern. I think it's a fascinating pattern right now. There's a tremendous amount of blocking in play.
I guess that's my concern, that I'll throw the first dart,
Yeah.
Matt. I think the negative NAO durability seems stronger to me, because it looks like we're maintaining more negative tilt structure across the Atlantic basin and the Pacific. Pretty much from all model sources, wave number situation over the Pacific increases, the complexity over the Pacific flow increases, and I think we're probably due for some kind of shift in the convective forcing, returning something back to the Eastern Hemisphere. And so I worry that the EPO might be the weak link here. I'm not sold that we can maintain more than a -1 or stronger projection in the EPO space. It might be more something neutralish. I'm not going positive yet, but more neutralish EPO. And in November, I think that's the more important thing. The Pacific pattern tends to be the more key driver. So that while I totally agree with the idea that the Euro can miss low-level cold, and the freaking Euro day 15 pattern would be a hell of a lot colder in the lowest 2 kilometers of the atmosphere than it's showing in its thermo. I wonder if the ridge is going to be that strong up through the Gulf of Alaska and Northwest Canada. And if it is strong, I worry that it's even farther west. And then you have short wavelengths to deal with. And so instead of Chicago, you're going to pound Denver, and Chicago might play in some of the warm air. That's my concern.
There was
you make some great points.
Yeah, the European was showing that late last week, and I really thought that was going to happen too, Jason. I saw the retrogression on Friday, heading back toward the Aleutians more with the ridge structure, and it was really surprising to me. Even though the southeast ridge buckled strongly over the weekend, it was surprising to me that the Euro shifted back eastward again with the ridge structure. And I wonder. I'm not a big fan of using these things, but I do wonder if the 2 recurving typhoons are playing a role in re-amplifying the North Pacific. The second one being the stronger one coming up here, but the intensity of the EPO by early 6 to 10 day, it's down to almost -3. And I wonder if some of that recurving typhoon energy is playing a role. It's not going west into China; it's turning north into the North Pacific. It's always very hard to discern that stuff, and I don't usually write about it too much, but I do wonder if maybe that's playing a role in keeping this going a little bit longer. Crazy. It'll be crazy to see how it plays out here, that's for sure. And I agree with you on the EPO being more important in November. The correlations with NAO in November are fairly weak. It creates a little bit of wedging in the Northeast at times, but it's not a main driver. It's if the EPO is lost, like Jason thinks could happen, I think that I would agree that the NAO wouldn't be enough to hold the ship on the cold side. We'd warm up quite a bit in the east and south.
Well, we certainly had a couple of interesting topics we brought up. Is there anything that anyone wants to really dive into and talk about more?
Yeah, we usually save a few minutes, like if there's something, something about the ECM model or CFS or the NAO or pattern or something, coming up here over the next few weeks. If there's anything of particular interest, you can spend a few minutes on that issue. Michael, I don't know, anything on your mind or?
I'm just kind of wondering a little bit about the recurving typhoon, like exactly how, is there a specific area typhoon has to recurve for it to affect our weather pattern, or does it just have to typhoon recurves and there's a downstream effect on us regardless?
It's a really huge mess. It depends on how it phases with the mid-latitude jet stream structure. And so if it phases with a trough around Kamchatka, then all of a sudden your downstream height rises to get really impressive on the Aleutian chain all the way up into Alaska. But if it doesn't phase with a trough, it could work the other way, or it could do what that last one did, which was just it did phase, but the whole trough came barreling into the Gulf of Alaska and all the way down the west coast. That was a very impressive typhoon response. So I've seen it happen both ways, and to me, it just creates if you add that energy to the northern Pacific, it just creates a lot more amplification in the pattern, and it creates a lot more extrema. And you see that in Europe too. When you get recurving Atlantic hurricanes, you get some really amplified pattern looks and everything. And it doesn't guarantee who's going to get the cold, who's going to get the warm, but it does seem to increase the vertical, on the jet stream pattern. It creates a lot more amplitude, amping things up. But I've seen recurring typhoons do a lot of different things. But I find that if you have a super typhoon like the one we had last week, it tends to have more of a chance of creating amplification. And so it's not this first one, Neo Jury, but the second one, which I cannot pronounce, Bua Loi, which is going to be on the edge of super typhoon status. That's going to be curving into the North Pacific. It's really interesting. I can't connect that one up to the -3 EPO on Sunday and Monday because it's too slow. It's not the same issue. But it does seem like later in the 6 to 10, 11, 15 day, that refiring of the EPO might be somewhat contributed from this issue. But it's still tough to say. The models don't, what they do with Atlantic hurricanes, the models don't integrate tropical activity into the mid-latitude jet stream pattern very well. They struggle with those issues. So it could create some volatility in our forecast and lower our confidence for a 16 to 20 day outlook here. So.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Matt, you said that, Michael's question was whether or not this recurving of the typhoon can affect North American weather. And if it does, like, how long is the lag period? Like, how long does it actually take for the U.S. to actually see the results of a pattern like that?
If you can get in the North Pacific, and it does do a phase with Kamchatka or really help force a stronger ridge over Alaska, by the time it gets up there, it's about a 5-day lag before you have a significant trough dig into the central Canada area or the plains, prairies, stuff like that. So there's a bit of a lag time there, but it's not a long lag time because it's kind of a domino effect on the jet stream pattern all the way across.
Cool, thank you.
Sometimes it can be durable, I think it was November of 2014. Sometimes the patterns impacts can be durable, but then if you have other upstream issues, other tropical forcing issues, anything else, it can be less durable, be more transient. So it maybe affect one cold outbreak, but then it's gone after that. So there's so many uncertainties and differences on how they evolve. The only thing I like to say with it is that it adds chaos to the forecast and it can create amplitude to the forecast, but it doesn't guarantee you an answer one way or the other.
And I was just thinking with our research hats on a little bit, because Zach's working on an MJO research project right now.
Huh.
One of the analyses I was looking at the other day that we were doing up is looking at the MJO HDD response from MJO as a function of lag or over time. And
okay.
And this is very preliminary, so I won't even share it. But what I was seeing, at least in some of the preliminary data, is the time lag in terms of the strongest signal was about 10 days or so. So there was a signal at 15 and et cetera, but it seemed to peak. In other words, if there was let's say warm signal associated with phase 3, that the peak response was somewhere around 10 days, and then it kind of was a little bit weaker. But
that makes sense. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I like that. That makes sense to me because I was thinking 5 days once it's already up in the mid latitudes, but 10 days if it's still, being registered as being tropical forcing, from an MJO standpoint. So that makes sense to me.
Yeah. And of course that's MJO, which it might be a little bit.
It should be slower because it's further.
Exactly.
Yes. Yep. I don't know if you guys saw this, but Paul Roundy has a paper, and I haven't looked at it yet, but there is a paper, I think, that does show typhoon impacts by MJO phase, like whatever the prevailing MJO base state is when the typhoon recurves. I don't know if it's breaks apart super versus regular typhoons or anything like that, but there is a paper out there if you guys want to look into that.
Cool. And I was going to ask, this is a question maybe for both you guys, but I think Jason in particular brought it up.
I think Jason left. Actually.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, this could be a question for you too then, Matt, because Jason brought up the influence of the Indian Ocean dipole. And I know that's come up a lot. And I was just thinking, can you talk a little bit about how you integrate lower frequency signals into your forecast process? Now, I know like if we had like let's say a strong El Nino, that might be a little bit more straightforward. But how do you integrate? How do you look at things like that? Like, hey, there's a strong Indian dipole. Does that influence your forecast colder, warmer, and sort of how does that work?
It doesn't really those low frequency things don't do it that much for me. It does make a lot of sense what Jason was talking about when you had the convection suppression in the Eastern Indian Ocean, because it does explain the MJO death that's going on right now with the European killing it off. And having, if the MJO was more progressive, if it went to phases 2, 3, and 4 with this slightly negative global wind that we have right now, it actually is a colder signal in November. And so it's giving it's and natural, and the American models are going more into phase 3, and I think that's why they're a little colder right now. They're about 19 heating degree days colder than the European over the 15-day window at this time. So I mean, it helps explain things to me, but my coworkers have done more work with the dipole the Indian dipole IOD, because it has a lot more influences on their Southeast Asia patterns and Australia patterns for the agriculture, growing seasons and everything like that. But in terms of helping maybe to explain some nuances with the MJO and stuff, I think that it could help, but I don't feel like it's a strong driver. I've never been able to, create a great library of IOD impacts on North American weather on a solid basis. I think there's so many other things at play that creates some chaos and stuff like that. It's difficult to pinpoint a feature like that. But it does make sense to me how it's affecting the MJO right now, and that is playing a role on this forecast challenge that we're seeing. And I feel like some of the MJO die-off is an averaging out effect of the West Pacific tropical activity and then the Indian Ocean fading. But it's a combination of both factors. This is killing off the MJO. But I do worry about that, because I do know there's an MJO death bias in phases 2 and 3 typically. So I do worry that at some point the European may kind of wake up and find a signal translating forward into the Eastern Indian Ocean just enough. And then all of a sudden we'll see a bigger blocking apparatus set up. Or it is pretty impressive already, I guess, to me. But maybe it's a little bit more solid on the European at the surface as well. I don't know, but some things to watch. Jason's much more into that than I am. He definitely uses all those low frequency things as bigger primary forecast tools than I do.
Okay. Well, we have a few minutes left. We could shift gears here. Michael, do you think 5-10 minutes is enough time for you to maybe, I think it'd be great if you could give Matt, sort of a recap of sort of what you've been working on, a quick introduction, some of the takeaways, and then we can solicit feedback from Matt on the research. We have time now, or even offline, or something like that. How does that sound?
Yeah, no, that's plenty of time, I think.
Okay, would you like the screen?
Yeah.
Okay. And so while you're waiting for the screen, why don't you introduce to Matt, because of course he's completely unfamiliar with it, a little bit about what you've been working on.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay. You guys can see the screen, okay, right?
Yep. Yeah,
Okay.
It's a little small, but we can.
If I can just zoom in.
Yeah, if you go to yeah, there you go.
There you go.
Okay, so my research, basic gist of it is I'm looking into methods to bias correct the European model, its HDD and CDD forecasts. So this is my preface and summary page. If you want to read more into that, I'm not going to read everything because I think that would take a little too long. But I've got the preface, which just goes through what I'm trying to do. Got some works in progress, things I'm still working on, and just a quick summary here. So I'll read this one. As of right now, most of my bias correction methods, and by most I mean all, have not been able to consistently outperform the euro. There have been some that have outperformed the euro. I'll show that when I get to the CDD season page. There have been some that have outperformed the euro, but not in a consistent manner. Here I have a summary page where I give input 1. So forecast input 1. This is actually the European model, I think. Yeah. their average MAPE, which is mean absolute percent error. I can give a quick explanation of that if you need it. And the average bias. So this just takes all of the biases over the course of the period that I've been doing the research and just averages them out. So far, the best bias, just looking at this, the lowest number of bias has been input 2, which is the most basic of my bias correction methods, and I'll show you these in a second. Just to so I have the summaries for all the inputs that I have. I included industries in here. I believe Maxar does is the industry forecast. So if you so I can read some of these if you want.
Hey, Michael, why don't you just real quick, just give them a little bit more context in terms of, we're looking at, I believe, the 16 to 20-day window. What's the season you're testing this over? Is it over 3 months?
Yeah.
And then I think just maybe even just start with just you can just describe, like, is it a 30-day bias correction, a 60-day, and then how the performance compares with the raw and any other sort of baseline or like a normal type metric if you have that.
Yeah. So I started this back I believe in July, and then kind of the dates start back in May 7th. So that's when we started the cooling season. I kind of backtracked since it was fairly simple to do. I take most of what I do is I take the regular Euro forecast, which is I believe we get from Maxar. Correct me if I'm wrong. So we take the CDD in this instance forecast from or I take the CDD forecast that we get from Maxar from the Euro, and then I apply my different bias correction methods. So I'll use this one. This one I just used the European bias from mid-July, and that happened to be 4.8 CDDs too cold. So I increased the number of CDDs on the normal Euro forecast. You can see here just by 4.8, 16.1 plus 4.8, nothing too complicated to start. And then I have the verification here. So this is what the actual number was, number of CDDs for that period. And I think I forgot to mention the period. It's the same as the forecast contest. It's the exact same periods. So it's 16 to 20 days from the time the forecast was made. So this one was made on May 7th, and 16 to 20 days, May 22nd to 26th. And then I look at the error based on the verification. So when the bias correction does better than the Euro, it gets a green highlight. If it does worse, it'll get a red highlight. And from there I went on and made plenty of bias correction methods. As you can see, some of them have done better than others. I also have down here a lot of MAPE scores. This is just mean absolute percent error, which the formula, if you're interested, is here. So it's 100. So to get to 100%, these are in percent values. Times the absolute value of the forecast minus, so it's the forecast minus the verification divided by the verification. So as you can see, these are more indicative of actual skill or performance than the actual.
Sorry to interrupt, but just because of time. The numbers. Can you give Matt some context here in terms of the numbers? In other words, and you don't have to go into detail. I think the main takeaways are sort of what we're thinking here. So, whatever the EC baseline is, let's say the EC error is 10, right? Raw. How do some of the other inputs look? Were they higher? Is a higher number better? Is it worse? And what was? I think you said the initial takeaway. You said that you evaluated a number of different inputs. Bias correction methods. I don't think we looked at anything too complex here. It's not like machine learning, but we tried to start with some simple bias corrections, looking over 30, 90 days. And I think, what did you say initially? The conclusion so far is that you did not find over the period of time that these bias correction methods significantly improved over the raw EC? Was that?
Well, it's some of them do improve. You can see input 4 and input 10 both approximately were 3 points better in MAPE score.
Okay.
Average MAPE score anyway. So there was improvement. It just wasn't consistent improvement. Because actually these scores were a lot further apart up until this last week, where almost every single one of my bias correction methods had over 10 points of error, I believe. So that was a little bit on the rough side. I am also. I'll just keep moving. I'm building the HDD season right now. I haven't had a chance to really update any of this, but I'll have that updated soon. I have a methodology page that just goes through the methodology for each of the inputs. And I have the name next to it. I should probably have the methodology before the summary. I don't know how that ended up there. So I can read some of this, go through this if you want as well. And then I just have a scratch testing page. The only thing I really want to show on here is this graph. This is just kind of a this is the average MAPEs for the inputs. So you can just kind of see from the graph real quick that most of them are clustered around the EC with 2 very poorly performing outliers and then 2 fairly well performing outliers. And I'm also trying to get a pie graph in there, but that's something for later. And yeah, that's essentially it. I can go through, if you have any questions, I can go through some of these other forecast methods, or bias correction methods, I should say, and I can go through, if you have any questions, I can go through.
Yeah, I had 2 quick comments. One was how you showed it was falling apart as you go later into the September here. I think that goes back to Dave's point about the summer with climate change being a little bit more impactful in terms of the summers being warmer. I think probably because of the low temperatures too. But so I think these various bias correction methods probably do offer some assistance when you're in a similar pattern regime most of the time. Maybe it's a little choppy around June, I guess, but in general, it seems like it probably adds value. But I was wondering if one of the things, this is my subjective observation, but over the years, so many years, that I find that if you're in, and this happened in like the 13-14 winter, for example, but if you're in a prevailing cold pattern, or if you're in a prevailing hot pattern, the models tend to underdo the extremes in terms of how hot the summers have been in the verifications, and then how cold some of the colder periods have been. So I was wondering if there's any way to do this sort of bias analysis with separate bins. For example, if you're in a prevailing, if May of 2019, or especially September 2019 was a prevailing hot pattern, analyze those bias corrections differently than, say, a month where you've had a prevailing cold pattern, like maybe March of last year or something like that, and try to break them up into their, and then that might give you some different answers, I guess. So then you can have a kind of a contingency, say, okay, well, we're in a baseline cold winter right now, so these are the typical bias corrections we should see with that, versus if you're in a hotter summer season, for example, and they'll give you a different bias correction answer. So I just didn't know if breaking those up, because that's been my experience. It's been particularly in the 11 to 15 days. So I think it would translate to the end out there too, that you would see if you're in a hot pattern, it's not hot enough. And if you're in a cold pattern, it's not cold enough. And that may help give you some bias adjustments to that.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out something along those lines. I was trying to do something like this, where I use kind of a couple of different what's the word, like reference points, where I try to, and then you say top 10 warmest years. If the euro's warmer than those top 10 warmest years, then I take that into account with, like, I have a bias correction that takes that into account, and then puts out a forecast based on whatever I tell it to do. Probably make it cooler, since, but maybe not. I don't know. It's a bit complicated, which is why I'm having some trouble with it, because if it's predicting something that warm, well, maybe it's right, and because at least during the summer anyway.
Yeah. It's one of those things you're playing the numbers game because, there was a cool push at the end of July, for example, this year. And I think there's one at the very end of August, early September, and they only last about 5 days or so. And so if you have a prevailing upward bias adjustment to the European model for most of the summer, it probably would do really well. It's just going to miss a few of those individual singular 5-day periods, like the one at the end of July. So you're playing a bit of a numbers game there, but I think most of the time the bias correction will work for you. But you will have some pain every once in a while with those one-offs. But yeah, to have like kind of a hot pattern base state bias adjustment and then a cold pattern bias adjustment, I think that might be helpful.
Yeah, I think I also I don't it's not exactly what you were saying, but I do have a reverse bias error, so that
Okay.
it essentially takes the bias error from this one, so this one makes the euro warmer, this one makes it colder.
Huh.
So I mean, it's no coincidence that when this one failed,
Yeah.
this one made it most of the time anyway. Euro
Yeah.
was actually pretty hard to beat that 1 week, but I'm also thinking of adding in. I don't know if this would be kind of also rather tricky, but one where it only forecasts a bias when it looks like there's going to be a pattern shift.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So Dave's been talking about this for, and Zach as well has been talking about this for a couple of weeks, where the models and the euro especially seems to struggle with pattern shifts.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Dave mentioned it'd be good, and I agree, to have some type of some type of bias correction or something that can account for the euro missing that pattern shift, because I think there's a couple of this one in particular,
Yeah.
August 27th, euro was pretty far off. So but the previous week it was actually pretty decent. So I don't know. So I assume that there was a pattern shift that it missed here and thought it would continue to be. I guess this is a little bit on the warmer side. Then I thought it would be cooler, but it wasn't. So it seems to have trouble with obviously with the pattern. So I think I'm going to try to put something like that in.
I think it was hinting at a cooler shift and it didn't happen. I think, is that right? Am I looking at those numbers right? I think if I remember,
yeah.
Timber was dealing with that. It was doing that last year too. Same issue last year, and then it finally got going by the second week of October. That's like trying to catch a falling knife. That's really hard to do.
Yeah, I mean, I don't expect to have a great deal of success, but it's worth a shot,
Yeah, definitely. I agree. If you've got the time and wherewithal to do it, it's always worth exploring this stuff, because it would be interesting if you could find something that's that's helpful in this, because these are huge challenges. That's for sure.
Yeah. All right. I know I've gone a little bit over, but Matt or Dave or Zach, does anybody have any added input for this? I'll take any criticism or suggestions.
I was just going to say, because I want to be sensitive to Matt's time, but Matt, would it be okay if occasionally going forward, Michael shared some of this with you and maybe solicited feedback on occasion?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Yep, definitely. Go ahead and if he doesn't have it, it's in the, I guess, the invite or whatever. My email address is there, so appreciate it.
Oh yeah, I can add you. Yeah,
Yeah, the only thing I'd say, Mike, is I had a question about it when you started showing it, but then you answered my question as you continued talking. I think you adding your page about what each input was and each the descriptions, you did a really nice job with that.
Okay, thanks.
Good job. All right. Well, Matt, thank you very much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed having
Yeah, thanks for having me. Yeah.
Having you. And we'll keep you posted on how your forecast does in the next couple of weeks. Hopefully.
Okay. Yep. Thanks.
Yeah. Hopefully we can have you back soon. So.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. Appreciate it. And all y'all have a good rest of your day.
All right. You
too.
too.
As well.
Thanks, you too.
Thanks, guys.